Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So this is a kind of video that I haven't really done before, but as you know, when I was travelling I shot some videos from my mobile phone, or cell phone for the Americans out there, asking for ideas of videos that I could do on the move, so without having weapons or books to hand, things that I might have in my head. Actually, you exceeded my expectations and you came up with loads of really good ideas. A lot of them, unfortunately, I couldn't really do because I didn't have the resources at hand to answer the questions properly. But some of those that I didn't have the resources to answer properly then, I have stored in my bank, as it were, and I've kept the ideas and I will do videos in the future about them. So fear not. That is correct, you can hear a cat in the background. That is my very annoying cat, who only screams when I turn the video camera on. So we'll ignore him. Looking down the questions list, there are some things here that I can I think are not necessarily worthy of an entire video, but some things which are worth addressing. And I thought it might be interesting if I do a video where I just kind of roll off some answers as I would in a conversation, essentially. So don't expect the most complete or learned answers perhaps that you would get to some questions, but hopefully interesting to some of you. So one question here from Morgoth Baugler, who is a regular contributor and commenter under my videos, says, an interesting topic that's maybe more open to speculation is what you think historical sword fights would actually have looked like. And by sword fights I mean between laymen rather than between masters of fencing treatises. It's a really good question, and it's a fairly short answer, I think. I think most of you, certainly for any of you out there who have lived in large cities or large towns, will have seen fights at some point. And I think pretty much fights look more or less similar across the ages. Yes, if weapons are involved then it changes the dynamic slightly, but all of you know the kind of, and even if you watch TV and you see these kind of police camera action type TV programs, you know how fights generally speaking pan out. They can either be pre-arranged, so a duel type situation, and of course that still happens in in prisons today, or in the street or wherever, where two people, maybe from rival gangs, arrange to essentially meet up and have a fight. And I guess there's very different psychologies for different types of fights that might happen. So there's the pre-arranged type fight, there's the type of fight that's essentially one person trying to mug or beat up someone else who wasn't expecting it, so the surprise fight situation. And then there's the kind of the drunken fight situation where two guys maybe had too much to drink and got into an argument, or maybe the kind of the anger argument, which can be domestic violence or argument over a infidelity or that kind of stuff. So I think it really comes down to what a fight looks like, comes down to the scenario. A fight where someone's jumped not expecting it out of the blue, and the person that is jumping them is either doing some kind of vendetta or is aiming to rob them, is going to look very different to a fight where two people have arranged to meet at a certain time, a certain place, and have a fight. However, I think there's some general things that we can say about real fights as opposed to martial arts sparring or the kind of fights that you tend to see on most TV and film. And that's that they're going to be a lot more scrappy. And I think certainly, I've seen a fair number of fights in my time, unfortunately, and pretty much universally they were all much more messy. Messy in terms of what the people were physically doing, technique. You can sometimes see technique, but it's far messier than it would appear in a competition or in martial arts training, of course, and obviously way messier than it would usually appear on television or film. And also I think, how to explain this, I think for people who are not used to seeing violence, it will also appear more horrific usually than it would seem on a screen. When you're watching something that you know is not real, life and death, it looks very different to when you're seeing something that you literally don't know what the outcome could be, and you know that that blood is real, and you know that there might not be an ambulance around the corner. It's a very different situation. So when people are at high stress, I think both the people involved and the witnesses around, whether they're involved or they just happen to stumble upon the scene, I think it looks very different to the people involved or the people watching, simply because you know it's real. There's a psychological, I think you see things differently when you know it's a real thing rather than a competition or a movie. So there's some thoughts, just some random thoughts that come into my head. I think, fundamentally it's difficult to answer the question because there are lots of different types of fights and they would all look different. Equally, a fight would look very different if one person is very massively more powerful or skilled than the other person, or if the two people are equal. Generally speaking, I think fights where the two people are more equal look more messy. If one person's very skilled or very strong, then the fight's going to probably be shorter and look therefore cleaner, so to speak, in terms of technique. Anyway, there's some thoughts. I've got another question here from Benja Freeman saying, please talk about British accounts of the Boxer Rebellion and what real kung fu fighters were actually like without all the Hollywood crap. I like that question, appealed to me because of the way it was worded. Firstly, I should say that Kung Fu is referred to in 19th century sources, and this is something I have specifically looked for in British accounts, and I have found accounts of Chinese martial artists in the 19th century. However, the top headline is that they're not flattering accounts. The Boxer Rebellion was literally called the Boxer Rebellion, and this is in sort of 1900 to 1902, I think it was, or around 1900 anyway. I can't remember the exact dates of the Boxer Rebellion. Maybe it was 1899 it started. But the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And the Boxers were known as Boxers because this rebellious movement actually grew up or was manned by lots of people who associated the what was known as the Boxer schools. And these are, of course, Kung Fu schools. So the British referred to Kung Fu fighters as boxers because that was their frame of reference. They looked at people probably doing something that was similar to Wing Chun Kung Fu, with predominantly actually punching and less kicking. That's one thing to mention, in fact, is that the Kung Fu that's described in British 19th century and early 20th century sources, it sounds like more like boxing and less like kicking. So the type of high kicking martial art that we're perhaps used to from Kung Fu films, or from whether we know Thai boxing or the sort of Shaolin type or Wushu type Kung Fu, it seems like it was not that. It seems like mostly what was done in places like Shanghai and Hong Kong was more similar to what we would think of as Wing Chun Kung Fu. So the kicks being lower, and predominantly fist work, and that's why they were known as boxers. And of course you've got to remember as well that European boxing at the end of the 19th century was not like modern boxing. It wasn't, well, it was with gloves in fact, but gloves were a fairly new introduction. I think they were introduced in about 1880, something like that. So boxing with gloves and the Queensberry rules was a relatively modern introduction. And in people's minds, what a lot of people thought when they talked about boxing was bare knuckle boxing, and in some cases with low kicks involved. So in actual fact, if you take a British boxer or pugilist from the year 1800 and compare him with a Chinese pugilist of the year 1800, you might find they were not doing that much different actually. They were both doing some kicks, lots of punching, use of the elbows, and because it's bare knuckle, they're probably less punches at the face because of course the damage to the hands and stuff like this. So I'm not an expert on armed martial arts. I'll get in Martin Ostwick or David Rawlings or someone like that to talk more authoritatively about that subject. But yeah, so there are descriptive accounts of hand-to-hand combat during the Boxer Rebellion, and indeed of Kung Fu at that time. But as I said, they're not flattering accounts. The general gist, and in fact if you look on the Scholar Forum, I have actually posted first-hand complete accounts there. which I won't reel off now because obviously I'm doing a light touch on a few questions. But they generally speaking say that their sword work was rubbish, that they don't use their swords very efficiently at all, and they say that their boxing isn't very scientific. Essentially, they sort of seem to view British pugilism as superior to Chinese boxing of the time. Now, this could just be a degree of racism or sort of nationalistic kind of, whatever, but I just kind of think to a large extent they didn't understand what they were looking at. So, and also you've got to remember, some of the people writing about this stuff, the people writing weren't themselves martial artists, they weren't military people actually, they were civilians. So yeah, there we go. But the other thing to mention as well is in looking for accounts of hand-to-hand combat during the Boxer Rebellion, the overwhelming impression you get is that there aren't many descriptive accounts of hand-to-hand combat from that war. I don't know why that should be. We know that there was hand-to-hand combat, mostly bayonet on the European side. Of course, in the Boxer Rebellion, it was there was a Allied army fighting against the Chinese. Allied British, French, German, Japanese, American, all pitted against the Chinese boxers, as they called them, and there definitely was use of the bayonet, because it's referred to, and definitely the boxers aimed to bring it to hand-to-hand combat if they could, because that was where their advantage lay, because they had a shortage of rifles, and the firearms that they did have were mostly quite outdated, and of course the European and American forces and Japanese forces by that date were using bolt-action magazine rifles. They had World War I equipment against these Chinese who, for the most part, had agricultural tools and knives and the occasional sword and the occasional axe, So it was quite unbalanced in that sense, although of course the Chinese were vastly more numerous. But it was civilians versus military, so not a very nice conflict, as most conflicts aren't. So there we go. On one hand, Kung Fu doesn't seem to have been very highly respected in Europe. In contrast to that, Japanese martial arts were, but I'll talk about that another time. And also, although we know there was hand-to-hand combat in the Boxer Rebellion, we don't know an awful lot about it. For some reason, not many people wrote about it. We don't know why.